Welcome to a radio show where we lay out the plain truth. It is a place where no conspiratorial rock will be left unturned, no mainstream propaganda will go unchallenged, and all existing reality boxes will be shattered. Piloting the discussion, as always, is the jet-setting international man of mystery, codenamed Plane. Co-piloting the storm clouds along with him are time veterans Herm, and the tea-drinking rabbit Oolong. This frequency is being broadcast across the secure Time Monk radio channels direct to you for your listening pleasure. So sit back, buckle your seatbelts, and ensure all overhead bins are secured because we are most definitely in for a very turbulent ride. Tonight's topic is, what is the opposite of dumbed down? And Plane, take it away.
Thank you, Herm. Well, I guess when we're talking about dumbing down, we have to think about what's happened and when did it happen and who did it and why. And I guess the general idea is who might want such a thing to happen. So I'll start out and ask Herm or Oolong, have you heard the term dumbed down before?
Yes, I have.
Where did you hear it? Do you remember?
I know Alex Jones ranting about it all the time, but I think may have heard a little bit of it on Jeff Rentz from Charlotte Iserbeat, perhaps.
Yeah, she has a book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, and that's detailed, very, very detailed, because she became an insider and smuggled out so many documents that prove that all the powerful foundations and the federal government basically want to make people idiots. And eventually she was caught and fired and so on and so forth, but she's a good resource. Herm, how about you?
Well, yes, the book you mentioned, and also, of course, John Gatto's famous Dumbing Us Down, the hidden curriculum of compulsory schooling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was actually, yeah.
Well, his famous book, I thought, was The Underground History of Education, something like that. In any case, the basic concept is there. And in these different sources, we can see, I guess what you'd say is policy documents, right? The goal is to make people stupid. It's not a mistake, it's a target. And so I think at the highest level, then, we've got to ask, okay, well, why would somebody want a nation of fools or a nation of people who can't function in the modern world? And I think when you think about it, what's in it for them? What's in it for the people with lots of money or power? Why would they want an educated population?
It'd be much easier to control a dumbed-down population. A lot easier to put wool over their eyes.
Exactly. I remember reading in John Gatto's book, or one of his books, there are surviving documents from ancient China where they essentially said our policy should be to make people uneducated and stupid. And that way, of course, the Mandarin class can have more power, relatively speaking, right? You know, the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind, he's got one eye, right? And so if you're a well-educated Mandarin and everyone around you can't read, can't function, can't do mathematics, then your power will increase. And with it comes salary and benefits and so on and so forth. So you can see that there are incentives for people. And then at a lower level, not just the super rich, but let's look at it from the point of view of, say, big corporations and their marketing campaigns, right? I mean, TV, America's and the Western world really are TV societies, right? So in terms of marketing, which makes the whole business model work, right? How's it going to work if people understand things? It's going to be much harder to sell stuff. Clever ads would still work, of course, but I'm just saying that fundamentally a lot of ads are not clever. They're just repetitive and stupid.
And subliminal.
And yes, of course, subliminal. But you see, that's again, if people were educated, they would know about subliminal stuff and they might turn it off or otherwise be less influenced. So education is not something that everybody wants, not really good education. And I thought I'd give you a quote from the Rockefellers' General Education Board. They gave out letters to their employees and whoever they wanted. And this was in the early 1900s. And it said the other aspect of this, and that is that they're control freaks who want to build what they consider to be a technocracy. In other words, a bureaucratic totalitarian system. And anyway, here's the quote. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. That's it.
That's pretty Orwellian.
Yes, isn't that? In other words, they don't want you to be able to think. They want you to be able to do what your parents did, only to do it in a better way as they see it.
It's almost like they want them to become drone bees.
That's how I read it. And this is what they were willing to say in writing, right, to, professors and such, right? In other words, this isn't like a secret document. This is what they will admit to. And they don't need, they say they have an ample supply of everything they need. So all that matters is turning the masses into essentially robots. And they've been working on it a long time. And by the way, there's an irony in this that isn't talked about much, but the Rockefeller brothers, David, Nelson, and so on, were victims of this system they created. They had, and David is still alive, they had great trouble reading in their lives. Did you know that, Herm?
No, I did not.
They've had to have personal tutors and writers and such because their reading skills and writing skills were so terrible. Because they got that ideal education that they wanted the American public to get. And I think that's really ironic. It's been used. It was, for example, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York and various other things like vice president, right? He used it as a political tool. Basically, he's saying, I can understand the challenges of people who are handicapped and so on, because I have, basically borderline dyslexia and great trouble reading or writing. And I think it came from the fact that they got this scientific form of education, which is so vastly inferior to what we got 100 or 200 years ago. But I do think it's an irony that's not discussed much now, that you have essentially the most powerful family in the country, and they themselves can't read very well at all. So anyway, it's not talked about, but it's not exactly a secret. As I say, Nelson Rockefeller used it for political purposes, and his family did too. So I think it's true. I don't think it's that they're making this up. I think it's actually true. And there are cases where they have a few, smuggled out letters here and there or something. And it's really quite appalling to think that a family of that, that level would be so dysfunctional. And then you think, oh my God, imagine what they've done to the whole country.
I think maybe they just can't comprehend literature because maybe they don't have souls like the rest of us.
That's another point,
No.
Yes. Maybe it's just because there's nothing there, right? They're just, whatever, created beings, right? That is a possibility. I won't deny that. That is a possibility. Okay, so anyway, we start out with the idea that education is inconvenient for people in powerful places, right? But I think that along with that, we have to be honest and admit that, at least in the States, the U.S., there's been a long utopian tradition that has made it worse. Herm, are you aware of that aspect of America, that there have been countless societies, groups, bestsellers and whatever, that basically wanted to totally change America and make it perfect?
Are you talking about in the sort of classical or old style intentional communities, or more disseminated type organizations? I mean,
Well, I think it's across the board. There have been all these communities that, I mean, seriously, hundreds of them that are interesting. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is just look at, let's say, bestsellers in the United States. If you think about, some would argue that, let's say, the most influential books in the United States in history would have to include books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was titled Uncle Tom's Cabin or Life Among the Lowly, which was a book that was not simply against slavery, it was against the whole, it argued that those in higher places had a moral responsibility to mold and shape and change people in poor places, right? And then you had Ben-Hur, right, which was from a Christian perspective saying that you could still eventually convert Jews. And then perhaps the most famous book that people don't know today, but it really, really influenced America tremendously, was a book called Looking Backwards.
Is that Edward Bellamy?
Butler,
Yes.
wasn't it?
No, Bellamy.
Oh, Bellamy. Okay.
Now, that book, which I've read, I don't know, have you read it, Oolong?
I took a course in utopian fiction, actually focused mostly on the dystopian. I'm familiar with it. It's sort of like a futuristic technocracy where, machines did all the work and people live in paradise, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. That's the general idea. It's something like looking back from 100 years, like looking back from the year 2000. And it's just bragging about all this endless progress that has been made in creating a technocratic, paradise. And the thing about that book, though, is there were countless societies created. I mean, it was a tremendous bestseller. And there were Bellamy clubs all over the country. And it also created the whole utopian novel as everybody copied it. And so there were, who knows, 50 or 100 novels that came in the next decade or two that were basically just trying to copy the idea. And but here's this socialist utopian book that got millions of people creating clubs and societies and things like that to try to build this technocratic paradise. And we can argue about why, but I'm just trying to say there's always been a strain in America of utopianism, right? The Pilgrims, right, wanted to build paradise on earth as they saw it.
Well, even you've referenced Bacon's New Atlantis. You could make an argument that the United States was founded on a utopian vision from the get-go.
Exactly. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we can look at some bad foundation or some, bad marketing firms and, big business and say they're a problem. But really the problem is a lot deeper than that. The problem is that you've got a combination of factors like this utopianism that promoted a bureaucratic socialist kind of system. And it was just naive to think that you could create, I guess what you would say is a better utopia than Karl Marx or whoever. Lenin.
You mean
right?
Karl Marx? I thought that was a dystopia.
Well, but I'm just saying to the people reading it, they thought that they were reading about utopia.
Right.
Right? Now, the fact, though, of course, is that's not what they got. Right? We do understand that.
Bait and switch.
But it was, yeah, this is getting old, isn't it? This bait and switch stuff. So I think we should look at that and then realize that it isn't just that the Rockefellers and Carnegies and such are bad. It's also that we have had at times millions of people who wanted to create paradise in the U.S. And paradise to them meant that you did what you were told, right? You were a robot. You were a robotic cog in a machine, and they thought the machine was just wonderful. And it didn't have all of this messy stuff that you found in American and European history. Messy stuff would be labor riots. Messy stuff would be, whatever, wars or discrimination, things like that. That's the theory, of course. The practice has not been so clean. And I think we can argue that a lot of them were either crazy or, I mean, basically some of them were communists, They loved the ideal more than people. They really didn't actually like people. But anyway, so I think we can go on from that and say, so this is the groundwork. There are these forces that have kind of conspired, I guess you would say, to create a dumbed down society. But then we can look at, okay, but isn't there a little bit more? Isn't there a higher level that want to create something even a little bit more sinister? And I think we can see that in different places. I mean, Aldous Huxley had a student named Eric Blair, and I suppose you've heard this story. Herm, are you familiar with Huxley and Blair?
I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
Is Blair Orwell's real name?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Aldous Huxley and his brother, and actually his whole family, are what you might call operative families for the British elite. And Eric Blair, who otherwise known as George Orwell, was from a family that essentially worked for the government in different locations like India, but probably weren't quite as high up. And well, I'm sure they weren't as high up, but nonetheless, I'm just saying he was talented and he spent time in the system. And that's how he wrote his classic 1984, as he was aware of what was going on. Anyway, Huxley argued in Brave New World that the future would be a kind of slavery where the masses were happy because they'd be drugged and they would have, whatever, television, things like that, right? Brainwashing. And that it really wouldn't require violence. Whereas George Orwell, of course, Eric Blair in his book 1984, has a more violent version, right?
Have you, I don't know, maybe this is where you're going with the story, but have you heard that there's a correspondence between Orwell and Huxley? After Orwell wrote 1984?
Yes, they had some. And I was going to point out that Huxley referred to Orwell and says, well, I think what you're really getting at is the permanent revolution. And by permanent revolution, Huxley argued that with modern techniques, there's no reason for a dictatorship to ever fall. In the past, they would fall because they ran out of bread in circuses, or a neighboring country messed things up militarily, right? But if you can create a worldwide drugged up system, it could go on forever, certainly for hundreds of years. And Huxley, throughout his life, still argued that he thought that from the point of view of the elite, it was much better to use drugs, television, education, as opposed to boots with,
stomping on someone's face for eternity.
Right. That's a messy way, right? Why do it in a messy way? You can do it with, drugs. Do it with, soma or whatever, something that people want, right?
Yeah.
Put something in the drinking supply that addicts them and makes them dull, right? That was Huxley's vision. Mm-hmm.
Have you heard, speaking of that, the latest that I've heard mentioned quite a few times is they're actually making arguments now to put lithium in the water supply because, it'll help prevent suicides, and that's a good thing. So we should all have lithium in the water supply, just like fluoride, because fluoride's a great thing too.
Yes, I've read that, and I think that I would like to see it in D.C. and maybe Manhattan. And then I and then I think the country might get on the right road again. Those people there are too ambitious. Yes, I'd heard that. But again, that's the insanity of it, right? You can't even call it insane because they believe in things like a permanent revolution, which is so crazy, right? I mean, they want to create a 500-year dictatorship. I mean, actually, it's kind of, you thought that the Nazis were crazy. They wanted to create a 1,000-year empire, right? Well, I'm not sure. These guys might be even crazier, right? Because here's the other thing. Is their society even going to function? Right? I mean, I gave you a minute ago the case that the Rockefeller brothers are basically not very functional. I mean, if they didn't have countless advisors and so on and so forth, they can't read and write properly. Now think about that. Well, this permanent revolution idea where everyone's drugged up and brainwashed from birth and whatever, is that the whole thing might fall apart. And indeed, I think you could make the case that right now, the quality of people who, okay, in some of our shows, we've talked about Brzezinski and Kissinger, right? And say what you will about them morally, but I think they were, I guess what you would say is competent at what they were doing. And I'm not sure that the people replacing them are, because they're victims of fluoride and bad education and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, you were going to say something, Oolong?
I was just going to say that I think what they want to make is a compartmentalized society where, each person has their own little job and they know that specific minute area of expertise, and they don't really know anything about the big picture. Whereas you look in ancient societies, and it was full of men like Da Vinci, Renaissance men that knew not everything, but knew a wide spectrum of knowledge and sciences. And it seems like we're totally at the opposite end of the spectrum from that model. But when you look back at those men, they're the people in history that we look at as the great achievers.
Well, have you ever heard of the book called The Schools of Hellas?
No, I haven't.
No.
Herm, you ever heard of it?
No, I have not.
Okay. Well, that was a book about 100 years ago that I think was fairly influential in its time. But the question, Hellas, of course, means Greeks, right? Greek stuff or Greece. And so the question is, what was their educational system, right? Particularly with Athens. I mean, we want to study Sparta and other places as well. But the question comes down to what was Athens like? And so this author wrote a book about it. What made them tick? And the answer, by the way, is quite simple: is there were no schools in Hellas. They didn't have schools, right? And that was the key. There was no homework. There were no tests, right? And I think you have to think about this a bit. The word itself, by the way, school, I mean, in Greek, it's, like skule or something, means leisure, right? Now, isn't that interesting? And how do you think they did it? Well, they did it in a garden, and they sat around and philosophized, right? And so you have Plato discussing things. And then the most famous place was Plato's Academy. But you also had Aristotle's Lyceum. Anyway, you had these places, and the idea was that you would have like lectures. You'd have maybe one in the morning, one in the afternoon. But the real thing is that you would discuss and debate. And by debate, I mean you would take positions and then try to pick them apart and understand things. That's what they had. And the kind of schooling that we have today is what they would consider to be forced training of slaves. And I think this is true. I think we have to think about that. What we have is really a Prussian slave control system. It's not. It doesn't make people able to think, which they consider the highest goal. And by the way, I mean, technical training like how to make a boat or how to build a road, that's all useful, but that doesn't really make you a functional citizen. And I think we see that today. There are plenty of people who have some skill, but they're really dysfunctional in terms of if you wanted to make a society based on them.
Have you?
So,
Are you familiar with the Waldorf schools, Blaine?
well, you mean Rudolf Steiner?
Yeah, he's a German occultist. His whole theory of education seems to make a hell of a lot more sense than what we have now, too. That kids don't learn so well by sitting at a desk looking at the front of the room for 6-7 hours a day. His theory was that they would learn better by going to the zoo or, picking up a musical instrument. Those type of activities tend to imprint their brains better.
Yes, that's true. Now, I think in all this you need good parents and good teachers, of course. But I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people, especially those close to the system, like teachers, can only imagine the system that exists today. They have a great deal of trouble imagining that the way kids learn is through, let's say, for example, taking different sides of an issue. If you read about Benjamin Franklin and his education, so this is one of the most important men in American history, the way he typically learned was by debating with his brother. They would take some issue of the day and take different sides and argue about it quite a long time. And it was just to understand and be able to think. And I think that's what's missing today, and we'll go into that a little bit later in the show. But the real thing is not endlessly learning things of some detail, like when did something happen in history, right? That's almost totally irrelevant. What's important is, can you think?
Yeah.
And that's where we're falling flat. And seriously, the Greek, particularly the Athenian system, is quite amazing to think about. All you have to do is ask questions of people who know a lot and are intelligent, and then debate them, and then have them critique your thinking. And you see where you can go. The sky's the limit.
I think some of the Buddhist schools in India and Tibet, I think that's how they train their young monks, is they just go out in a forum and pick topics and debate, and apparently it hones their mind to a razor sharpness.
Right. Well, I suppose now we're at a point where it's worth talking about the traditional education that we think of, the classical education, which I'm a fan of. I think it's a good thing. The 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium. Are you familiar with these terms? I mean, Herm, are you familiar with the 7 liberal arts?
Well, the European educational system is still somewhat based on that. Yeah. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Excuse me. There's what happens in the earlier grades is a sort of a tracking thing where people sort of decide or decided. It is decided whether they're going to move ahead with vocational technical training or more scholastic pursuits that lead to perhaps a professional career. And I would have to say, at least in the Italian system, it's much more rigorous in some ways than it is here, and that's good and bad. Especially especially for individuals who can't sit still. Along you were saying about sitting still, and that rang. Remembering back, that rang true about how terrible that was. But boy, but aside from that, I think once you get into the middle, what would be the 7th, 8th grade, and then the 4 years of high school, it's much more rigorous than here. And I think if you go into Eastern Europe, it gets even more rigorous. But then again, it's more that's more towards more towards the fields that then can be exploited via technology, i.e., physics, chemistry, that kind of stuff, math.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I think that Europe, I mean, particularly Eastern Europe, has been influenced by the Prussian system way too much. But if you're going to do it, you should do it with rigor. Right?
Right. I guess that's one way to put it. Right.
So I'm not. Look, there are no absolute answers to things. We're just trying to discuss general ideas here. And I'm going to say that we've now created a society in America, but it's spreading throughout the world, where people really can't think properly. And this, to me, in a sense, makes, well, how can I say? A lot of people talk about we need solutions, right? The world is not going in the right direction, okay? Particularly in the Western world. Okay, well, when you want to discuss solutions, first of all, we need to get it so that people can think. We need to get it so that people can imagine how to create groups or ideas or systems or such. And if everyone is too dumb, too drugged up, and too tired or whatever, the adrenal glands are shot, well, then it's really going to be very, very hard. And so I think we need to start with education and the ability to use the mind. And if you look at the traditional approach, I mean, they had, for example, what did you start with? You started with grammar and logic and rhetoric, right? Grammar is how you put raw data and put them in a correct structure or something like that. You build a body of knowledge. And then logic is to try to eliminate contradictions. It's to try to make it make sense, essentially. And then rhetoric is the ability to gain insights from it and to explain it. And to, I guess you would say, in a sense, be able to debate it, to put it, the pros and cons, against somebody else who's making a different argument. And this is really very, very important. I mean, some of us take things for granted that are being lost, okay, because maybe we had the advantage of a good school. I mean, I had, I was fairly lucky in this department, but many haven't been. And you can see how literacy is collapsing in the United States. They measured incoming people into the American military. And let's say in the 1930s, I think it was something like 98% of them were literate. And then in World War II, it was down to, let's say, 96%. By the Korean War, it was down to, let's say 85% or something. And indeed, the American military thought this was practically a crisis. What had happened? Well, the answer is modern education, right? Modern education started kicking in the let's say 1940s. Because after all, the United States essentially had a takeover by these the big money people with all of their foundations and everything. They took over medicine, they took over education, they took over all kinds of things. The legal schools, and it became this kind of rote learning with brainwashing as opposed to being able to think. And they also, of course, got the change in phonics and other things is a long topic, but that's another thing that essentially we got to the point where many, many people today can't read properly. And I think if you visit the United States, for those who aren't aware of it, you'll go and buy something somewhere. You have to always be careful about the change you receive, because so many people can't do simple mathematics in the United States today. It's really quite amazing. So anyway, though, you can see how is it the country went from being incredibly literate. I mean, 200 years ago, I gave that example of The Last of the Mohicans. The uncut version of that is an incredibly difficult, thought-provoking novel. And that was a mega bestseller at that time. And so this is back in an age when you didn't have universities, you didn't have whatever. And then you look at today. It's really incredible. There's been a total collapse. It's not just a minor decline. There's been a total collapse in American society. And the good news, though, is I think we can turn it around quite easily because people have amazing abilities. But anyway, getting back to like the trivium, the classical subjects, the trivium and quadrivium, I think we can benefit by looking at people like Aristotle. I mean, they're just saying that everyone can do this. This is not something that you have to be rich or anything. Anyone can think. And I think this is borne out. I mean, if you see what they did. And then, by the way, after you get that, then the next level gets much more into what you might call things like the scientific method or whatever. I mean, that's a modern term, but I mean, how you generate hypotheses and so on, and how you recognize logical fallacies. And I remember that one of the things I enjoyed most in school was the study of logical fallacies. And there are maybe 25 common ones, right? But it's very, very beneficial because, I mean, you could just put a list of these next to your computer or television. And I mean, I think you're going to see.
It's funny because I have that website bookmarked. It's IZOR's, I think it's IZHORS site of logical errors. It's perfect because sometimes I need to remind myself that what I'm reading truly is illogical. I'm not just biased against it, you know. But anyway, yeah, I understand what you're saying there. That would be very, very useful, but not useful. Well, very useful to citizens, not useful to elites. That's for sure.
Exactly. Not useful to Madison Avenue. But I mean, seriously though, I mean, I feel like it's such a good thing that a list of these logical fallacies should be given to all, you know, children when they get to a certain age or something, or graduating from high school or something like that. Because remember, you're going to run into these every day of your life. Right? And don't fall for.
I wanted to ask you about, you know, you were mentioning earlier about the sort of, I guess, this utopian movement that took place in the U.S. and then related it to this larger kind of feeling that people have that, boy, things are really screwed up and I really want to make them better. And I think what may be ironic here is that in reference to a friend of mine who has identified a group of people that is really necessary for especially larger systems to carry out such things as educational reform. And I will not say it on the air since it is a family show, but he calls them the expletive do-gooders. And these are sort of people that aren't in the know, so to speak, but are driven by their heart and really do want to make things better, like being depressed is bad, so let's put lithium in the water of the DC water supply, right?
Well, I mean, that's the modern Bolsheviks, right?
Exactly, right. But I guess
meant well.
They certainly did, and Lenin was an idealist through and through, wasn't he?
Yes.
So yeah, I mean it's I think
not
it's
as much fun when you're on the what shall we say? You're ideally dead because
you have the wrong ideal, right?
You have the wrong thinking. You have
exactly.
bad thoughts.
But I think
okay. So your question is, what do you do about the do-gooders?
Yeah,
right?
The do-gooderism. It's the do-gooderism. I think that because they are the apparatchiks for the elite in carrying these highly destructive social programs out. So, yeah, what do you do?
Well, oh boy, what do you do about the desire to make a perfect place, right? And by the way, a lot of these people who want to make you and me perfect are far from perfect themselves. Right? What I mean, they're like,
right, do as
pounds,
I say, not as
50
not
pounds overweight. They don't exercise. They eat junk food, right?
But you got to go up and down the elevator if you're in New York City because, I mean,
they're going to lecture you about something because, they got a master's degree in bossing people around and now they work for the city and they are in charge of some bureaucratic, thing. So it's really quite ironic that we have so many of these do-gooders when they really ought to, there needs to be a do-gooder anonymous. You know what I mean?
Yes, I'll be happy to run it.
Yes, I'll help them. I'll help give
somewhere,
them a place to hold their meetings.
somewhere in a geostationary orbit, hopefully. But yes.
Have you guys ever seen the coat of arms of the Fabian Socialists?
Oh, sure, of course. Yeah.
It's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Well, it's so funny, but I don't think they mean well. You know what I mean? I think they are wolves, right? Herm's point was more about the I guess what you would call it is the sheep with bad habits who want to fix our habits, right? Um,
Right. I guess maybe you could, the large, the woolly sheep with bad habits or something, just to differentiate them. Because I think it differentiates by class, somewhat by education as well. A lot of those people tend to go to more elite private schools and the usual bevy of, private colleges, and then they come out for lives of grand public service in the service of do-gooderism. And I mean, and I'm telling Plain, who knows better than I probably, that the capital of the U.S. is crawling with such people. So anyway.
Well, that's what I was saying. That's why we need lithium in the water.
Okay.
Things, right? It's because, I mean, there's a kind of magnetism that draws them to D.C. and to, Manhattan or something. Well, this is, a very, very long topic. What do you do with the utopianism? And I started this show talking a bit about how that, in a sense, is as much of a problem as the Rockefellers or whoever, right?
Right.
Is they really, really want to build this perfect world. And they don't like a messy, good place. That's not okay. That's not enough. They want, like, perfection. And perfection doesn't exist. And the more they try to, like, artificially create it, the more it turns into something like the communist revolution or whatever. It turns into a whole disaster. And it's just sad that people can't recognize this problem. But I don't have an easy answer for the the do-gooder virus or whatever. I might call it. You're a medical guy. I might call it a miasma, if you know that term.
Miasma.
The do-gooder miasma. It's
right, or do-gooder brain lesion is more maybe. Yeah.
Yes. Well, well, what can I say?
I just brought it up because
I think, though, it's interesting because, you see, they get used and they don't even know it because they're so blind. You see, they're so into their utopian vision that they can't see that the people above them are just using them. They're not going to create some perfect society. They're just going to be used. And I think if you look at, we're talking about education, really, basically here, or how to think. And look at the actual results on the ground. The results on the ground are the country is 1/10 as literate as it was 200 years ago, which is totally absurd. With the extra wealth, I mean, it's totally ridiculous. I mean, you see numbers, and I don't know how accurate they are, but I mean, there are people who seriously argue that in the United States, 40% of African Americans are basically functionally illiterate. I don't know if that's true. I'm just saying you see different numbers. And you think about that and you say, this is just so unbelievable. And yet there it is. And I'm saying that this happened also because the people above them wanted it to happen. But now I want to move on a little bit to one other aspect of this. And I think that this is now, we're going to get into the bread and circuses, is that making people comfortably numb is kind of like a social goal today. And so you talked about the lithium, Herm. Well, maybe we don't have the lithium, but we have everything else to make people kind of, how can I say it, inactive, kind of uninterested. We've got unlimited sports, right? We've got cheap fashion. We've got cheap beer. I mean, I think that's like American policy, right? And so there's this desire to make people kind of comfortable but lazy. And no matter how outrageous, like this, the banker scandals of the last decade, and there are hardly any protests.
Yeah, that really surprised me tremendously. It was a very depressing time. Yeah.
Well, now you can argue that that's because people know that the police will just like knock their teeth out for no reason, or pepper spray a baby or something like that, right? And there's certainly an element of that nowadays. But I think it's also because, truth be told, the policy has been to make people indifferent, and worn down to the point they don't really have the energy, either physical or mental. And this goes together with the making them stupid, right? So now they're stupid, lazy, tired, right? Well, of course they're going to be easy to control, right? And notice how when they discuss things on TV or in the media, they put it in a way that really can't get to the issue. The terms are misleading, like quantitative easing 3 or something.
Oh boy, I was
Right?
going to say, when you were talking about the Rockefellers, some of them not being able to read. I mean, I wonder how one might characterize that complete incompetence, say, of our monetary authorities. Who, for example, Mr. Bernanke, who seems to really believe in his graduate thesis in spite of all evidence otherwise, and continues to do so. And like you were saying, I think I'd never thought of it this way, but that's why we have the show. I would have to say that perhaps he may have also lost some ability to reason things out. Anyway.
Well, I think guys like that are picked for their being a certain personality type and so on. I mean, they're just, in a sense, a dime a dozen.
Right, and maybe they're picked not to notice as well.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean,
who knows?
The Rockefellers have, well, he's not solely a Rockefeller employee, but I mean, the Rockefellers have used, personal tutors and different things like, some of the Austrian economics school guys were, like personal tutors for David Rockefeller in London, and then they're brought over to the U.S., like the University of Chicago. And they're really just basically saying what, rich guys want to hear. That doesn't mean that Austrian economics is all bad. I'm just saying that, how can I say it? There are plenty of people who say things that somebody in high places wants to hear.
Right.
And it's easy to imagine, that you have somebody like Greenspan, who was supposedly, we're told, a fan of Ayn Rand and, the gold standard. And then, well, then what are you doing working as an operative, ruining the country with the kind of stuff you're doing, right? I mean, wouldn't Ayn Rand's characters be throwing you off a bridge or something, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. There was a little dichotomy there in his life, pre and post. But then again, he never actually had a private sector, or he had one private sector job from which he was fired for bad predictions. So, and it's true. Look I have checked this wiki.
I hadn't known that, but I believe it. He's definitely nothing to write home about, if you ask me.
Unless he's trying to take the system down from the inside.
Well, that's the thing. I think a lot of these guys are actually operatives. I use that term. I don't think they mean well, and I don't think he meant well, and I don't think Bernanke means well. They're doing what they're told, and frequently I think you're told, don't ask too many questions. Because you see, if you interface with the public, you might accidentally say something that you shouldn't. And I think you see that now and then with different characters, like President Bush II, right? Now and then would say something, and it's like, I don't think his handlers wanted him to say that. Right? And so you notice how the press have become more and more restrained and constrained. Right now, it's like you have, all your approved questions have to be in advance, right? Everything has to be totally scripted because, we've got some lightweight here who might say something. I mean, you could trust President Clinton because he was a conniving, sort, right? One of those evil lawyer conniving types. And he wasn't going to go off the reservation and say something. But Bush II now and then said stuff that I'm sure they had to cringe a little bit. And so now it gets more and more controlled. And so I don't think they're going to tell Bernanke everything. No way. Because he might slip up. And who knows, at a party he might get drunk and say something he shouldn't. So I think a lot of people are paid to not know, to be honest, in the system. And that includes the military as well. They're essentially, they're front men of a sort, but they don't really know where the bodies are buried. and I don't think they want to know. You know what I mean? The mafia wife doesn't know
Right.
where the bodies are buried, and she shouldn't know. I think is the point I'm trying to say. Yeah. Anyway, what can you say? These guys, they get hired. They're just a dime a dozen. They're all over, and they hire them, and they're really bland and forgettable. I mean, the guys from 100 years ago like that, you don't even think about them. The ones that are more interesting are like Colonel House, right? And that's at a higher level. In other words, these are the guys who choose the Greenspans and Bernankes, right? And it's worth reading their stuff. And indeed, he's a key part in the dumbing down of America. Okay, so a second ago, I talked about Colonel House, who was a key operative 100 years ago in making America what it became. And I guess, first of all, I'd ask, have you heard of him? Oolong, do you know who he was?
Never heard of him.
Herm?
Neither have I, Plin.
Well, he was said to be President Wilson's handler. But he was a lot more than that. He wasn't just a handler for a president. He was an operative for the true power structure that came to be formed. So we're talking about the Federal Reserve. We're talking about the whole Eastern establishment. And he wrote a book called Philip Drew Administrator, which is a utopian story of how he wants this perfect, in other words, he would be Philip Drew. In other words, he would boss everybody around and control everything through bureaucratic means. But again, it's kind of this utopian vision of a class of people who will create what became a modern bureaucracy, right? That will be more powerful and controlling and so on and so forth. Now, he didn't necessarily get into all the conspiratorial angles that he was well aware of because he worked for these criminals. But truly, he was a key man in forming the Federal Reserve. He was Wilson's controller. So when you talk about the setup to World War I, you talk about the Federal Reserve, you're talking about this guy. And he was quite an interesting character. And if you read about his early days in Texas, I mean, the schooling he got was much more of the ancient Athens than anything we're used to. But he had that utopian streak. He wanted the elite, and of course he saw himself as being elite, to micromanage the rest of us. In other words, he was a control freak, right? Which is part of this whole do-gooder thing. And his influence is felt today because I think a lot of the people we can't stand today look back on him as their model, their role model, right? He's really a very, very important character in American history. And it's unfortunate, but I think you can look into him and see what I'm talking about. It's kind of his period is where modern America got created in many ways, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the IRS, World War I. And along with World War I came a lot of bad things. It's where we got started on the whole, I guess you would say, internal war as policy, the Red Scare kind of thing. Rounding up dissidents, the push to lead to national police, things like the FBI. All kinds of bad things came out of that period of time. And he was the man behind a lot of it, at least in terms of making it happen. So he's worth looking into, Colonel Wendell House. So anyway, moving on to a couple of other thoughts about this, I think it's worth mentioning in a little more detail Charlotte Iserbyt and John Gatto. Because a lot of what we can see as an interested layman, so to speak, we can gather from their books. And we talked about them a little bit earlier, but I think we kind of ought to put it in a more structured way or something. Do either of you know the story of Charlotte Iserbyt? Do you know who she was or how she got where she was? Oolong?
She was I'm not sure which administration, but she was in the education department, I believe, and I think she had seen some of the agendas that were being pushed down, and I don't know her story in detail, but yeah, she wasn't too impressed with what she saw.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's basically correct. I mean, her father was in Skull and Bones,
Oh,
So she
yeah,
was
yeah. And she was friends with the fellow that wrote the book on Skull and Bones, too. Sorry, his name
Sut,
escapes me. Sutton,
Sut,
yeah.
mhm. So, but she came at things from a Christian perspective and perhaps more of a conservative perspective. But she'd been in things like the diplomatic corps, whatever. She's, from a proper elitist family from Maine, I guess. Um, but the important thing is back then the Republican Party was trying to get a lot of women in positions. So Reagan put Sandra O'Connor on the Supreme Court. Anyway, they made a big push. Catherine Austin Fitts was chosen. You know, I guess what I'm saying is it wasn't the sole factor, but there was a big push to get women, and so that was that period of time, and it probably increased her odds of getting the position she got. And so she got into the Department of Education, and I don't know if she was number two or I don't remember exactly what level she got to, but it was essentially a political thing. And she was not a player. She was not part of the system. And when she got in there, she got access to all these documents from different foundations or how can I say it? There's stuff that's secret but not secret. How about I put it that way? In other words, there are foundations, there are government meetings, there are things where it's not stamped classified, but you and I can never get access to it. There's a lot of that in D.C. And anyway, so she got access to a lot of this, and she smuggled out countless documents or copies of documents and eventually got fired for doing it because she was so outraged at what she had seen. And it's actually worse than what we're discussing in many ways, because in addition to making people dumb, they want to make people slaves too. But anyway, that's where she's coming from. Herm, were you familiar with her story a little bit?
Yes, I was familiar, at least not with all the detailed background, but the position that she held in the Department of Education. Yeah, and I've read her book, or at least the deliberate dumbing down, at least a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's have you read it? Have you got?
Yes, I've
Or,
read it. I haven't
and
read it lately. It was a while ago when I read it. There probably are updates and better stuff and more, more targets to
more
fight.
details, but yeah. Well, well, for me it was sort of the classic work. I actually ran into her before I heard of John Taylor Gatto.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Mm-hmm. So now we
so,
get into John Taylor Gatto, and um, I think well, you may know that. So he was a successful teacher, right? He won, like, let's say, Teacher of the Year award 3 years in a row in New York City, something like that. And he wrote a book called something like The Underground History of American Education or something like that. And he goes into essentially the history of education in the United States. Are you familiar with him a little bit, Oolong?
I've seen some interviews with him, mostly about tragedy and hope. I haven't read his book, but seems like an interesting character.
Mm. Well, I recommend his book because Charlotte Iserbyt's book is essentially very dry. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. It's full of documents, and it illustrates the painful thinking that we're fighting. But in a sense, it doesn't give you the picture the way John Taylor Gatto's book does, which is much more, how can I put it? Much more, well, anyway, it would go into the kind of this utopian thinking. It would go into the religious aspects. It would go, it's much more, a much wider scope, I think. So I really recommend it. In any case, these two are perhaps our biggest sources for thinking about this as non-specialists. What has happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? Right? And, as I said a while ago here, a lot of it came out of this utopianism. It's not simply that the Rockefellers are bad or that Madison Avenue is bad. I mean, in John Gatto's book, there's a quote that I think you could hardly believe, and the many quotes, but I mean, one of them really stood out to me, where the the principal of a school in Atlanta, in a like a rich suburb, was talking about computers and technology, and she said, "I'm not sure you ever get to the point you have enough technology. We just believe so fervently in it." And you listen and you read these the things these people have to say, and you just say, they're just believers, right? It doesn't matter. Can you demonstrate that the technology is helping you, right? Are the students reading better? Are they getting better scores in their arithmetic? And they don't even make that argument. They just believe. They have this utopian vision that if we just have more technology, and Gatto in his book talks about cases, like say Silicon Valley, where they have all of this high-tech stuff that's like stored in the school warehouse because it just accumulates. It's like this year's fad and last year's fad and the fad before, right? They got all these gadgets all over the place that they're not using. Endless gadgets, right? Because it's not a technology problem. It's a human problem, right? I mean, it's not like Silicon Valley has too little technology, right?
Yeah, but just think if you could just sell one Apple computer to every single child in the US and Europe every year, you know? I mean, that's I think where that was going at some level.
Oh, I think the politics of it, for sure. I mean, nobody got fired for buying Apple in a school in Silicon Valley, right?
But you know what's funny is that a lot of the major, you probably, I can't remember the person's name. He was written up in the New York Times because he was a major mogul in one of these technology companies there, and he was sending his kids to Waldorf school, which abhors technology until around 8th grade. And and you know, during the interview, they mentioned, you know, well, are you the only standout? And he said, no. In fact, most of my friends send their kids to Waldorf schools because it's a lot saner. You know, they get to dance and they get to learn. You know, when they're in 2nd grade, they get to learn their arithmetic by, you know, clapping their hands and doing dances. You know, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, rather than, you know, sitting down and so. Anyway, so he went through the whole thing and. But what was actually fascinating was the slew of letters that came in after the piece got published. So even, you know, that told me that clearly at least, you know, those people understood that, you know, that technology was the last thing that was going to save education. But so.
Well, that's part of the classical education, though, too. The music is a key part because it's kind of like part of numbers. I mean, there's numbers. And then there's numbers in space, and then there's numbers in time. You know what I mean? There's a logical flow to all this, and I agree with it. But anyway, you know, when I was reading Gatto's book, I skimmed through it before this show, and I wish somebody had told me something because, you know, back when I studied Latin in school, they could have done it a lot better. You know, it was done in a boring way. That was one of the problems. You've probably heard the word pedagogue, right? Oolong, are you familiar with that word, pedagogy?
I've heard it. It's not something I use in my day-to-day conversations.
Herm, are you familiar with the term?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, I am.
Oh, well, you're from Italy, right?
Well, I mean, in a sense, we are engaging in pedagogy right now.
Of course, exactly, we are. But I'm just saying it's probably learning Latin is a little easier if you're from Italy, right?
Ooh, you're right. You're right, though.
You know,
unfair advantage. Okay. All right.
There you go. But anyway, I didn't realize this. I mean, I just memorized the stuff in school the way we're supposed to, like all good schoolboys. But I didn't realize it. According to John Gatto, the word pedagogue is Latin for a specialized class of slave assigned to walk a student to the schoolmaster. And then over time, the slave was given additional duties so that he became a drill master, right? And then they have in his book, he talks about some of the traditional things and references to it in like ancient, you know, Roman texts and things like that, how they worked and what they did. But essentially, I guess what I would say is it's like what can I say? Not the teacher, not the master who knows the subject. It's the one who forces you to go through the drills, so to speak, right?
The teaching
And
assistant, right?
yeah, yes, more along the lines of that, but perhaps a more militarized version. I'm not really totally sure. Okay, and I think it's kind of funny then, from their thinking, I guess you would say it was much more of a slave kind of system idea than what we might think. And so pedagogy is, we just use it to mean teaching essentially. But the derivation of it is much more like forced drills done by a guy who's a slave, which I thought was kind of interesting. The derivation of words is always kind of an interesting topic. But we have got this problem that at some point schooling became more like, well, this is how we create soldiers, or this is how we create factory workers, right? In other words, the goal of the people controlling it was not an educated society. It was, we need to make it so that they're smart enough to put bullets in a rifle, right? They're smart enough to turn the cog on the machine, whatever it is they're supposed to do, 45 degrees, 5,000 times a day or something like that, right? And anyway, this John Gatto's book has a lot of great stuff on how education was actually done in different eras and different places. And interestingly, there's a bit in there I found interesting that I hadn't known, which is, in a sense, Indian education, as in Hindu education, spread to Britain and the United States, which is a long topic. But it was to preserve and create the class system, the caste system they had. And it doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy to think that, you would send people over there to study, right, their caste system to try to bring it over here. That just doesn't seem like...
That's very un-American, actually.
Well, what can I say? It was once upon a time. You know what I mean? To the founding fathers, that would have been very un-American.
Indeed.
But perhaps to these colonel houses, it wasn't. Anyway, Gatto in his book also goes into, I think, a bit of what we might say, how a whole professional class was created that included marketers. And so you get into Edward Bernays, and he discusses some of that. The marketers saw themselves as part of this managerial class, right? They, what can I say? Edward Bernays is a key character. I'm sure you've at least heard of him if you don't remember his name. He was, I guess, what was he? Was cousin or nephew of Freud. He was related to Freud, but he is like the godfather of PR. And his books are also essentially used as like introductions to, I guess what you'd say, darker stuff, mind control technology and stuff like that. And if you want to study things like hypnosis, the hypnosis of Milton Erickson, the famous hypnotist, you kind of want to have an idea of how the mind works. And so Bernays would go with that. Anyway, speaking of this, by the way, are you aware of Milton Erickson, Herm? Had you heard the name? Do you know who he is?
No,
who he was?
Nope.
Oolong?
Is he an NLP guy?
Well, NLP would be a modern thing where Milton Erickson is like the grand godfather of American hypnosis and one of the world figures. He's gone now. I actually have a friend who studied under him. And his view was that the public should not, only professionals should be messing with this stuff because it's so powerful. And it would shatter the reality boxes of a lot of people if they knew the kind of stuff that could go on. And I'm not referring to mind control. I'm referring to all kinds of things like psychic abilities. There's a lot, under hypnosis, somebody could tell you their medical conditions, for example, right? Cancer is going to form in this location and within a few years if something doesn't change, or that kind of stuff, right? Wow. And it would, and then stuff that some people are really going to have a lot of trouble with, like past lives, that kind of stuff, right? But it goes together because hypnosis is just kind of a more hardcore form of marketing, right? Because now they use subliminals, they use all kinds of tricks. But anyway, John Gatto in his book goes into this to some extent. And, if you read the classics of what Bernays did, some of his programs, it's really, he argued that, how can I say it? He argued that democracy was just a fake. It was a front. He said that an invisible power was now in total control and was going to only get in more control over time. And the technical people who knew how to do this would be the people running society. And he's famous for various things like getting women to smoke cigarettes. All of those marches where women were to get equality by smoking.
The suffragettes.
The suffragettes. He was behind all kinds of things where he'd make you think that you were doing it on your own and you were being like modern or progressive or whatever, and you weren't. It was totally a marketing campaign. And I think we still see that today. You see people who are promoting something, hope and change or something of some form or another. And it's like, you're just being suckered by some Madison Avenue operative, right? So he's a key figure to look into, Edward Bernays, because he was essentially a branch of that technocratic elite that has been created. And we have to be aware of those folks. They are so important. Let's see. Any questions? Any thoughts on him, Harm?
No, I will. But I will definitely check his story out. That's very interesting. So.
Yeah, same here. I'm going to add that to my reading list, my long, ever-growing list.
Well, you're gonna drown in books, though, right?
Yeah, I'm almost there.
I'm almost. Well, what I'm waiting for is osmosis. I always have argued that that's the true evolution that's needed.
The Ager
is
case
that I
method,
I want to be able to sleep with a book because I can only read one book a day, and to get any more is going to require like getting it at night. But my tests with that haven't worked. Playing a tape, it hasn't worked. Well, Herm, you're into lucid dreaming, right? Maybe you can talk about that. Is there a way of learning while you sleep?
Oh, absolutely. But the things you learn about may or may not have much to do with your everyday life, so to speak. I mean, I think.
Sure, of course.
But yeah,
you know what I was saying. I'm asking about practical stuff.
Practical. Well, I mean, do you mean lucidly dreaming and reading? Reading something and learning, or, I mean, one of the things that I've experienced is, for example, having questions. If I find myself lucidly dreaming and I have a question. And it might be, whatever. Whatever. Occasionally, I get to talk to someone, and so in that sense, and I can bring it back, obviously, since it's lucid. And so in that sense, I think there is learning, but I think that it's a very different kind of learning. And,
well, anyway,
we can certainly talk more about it. I'm always happy to go into it, but it would be distracting, I think, from...
Yeah, well, it's not the focus of today's show, but I'm just pointing out that we need to be open-minded in figuring out how we can learn almost from anywhere, really. And it's possible that maybe you can't just listen to a book when you're sleeping. It hasn't worked for me. But, maybe listening to music does help somehow. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably another topic for another point.
I did have one question. Is how was he related to the psychologist who I guess takes credit for the founding of experimental psychology? He was a German
Skinner?
No, actually, Wilhelm Wundt.
I don't know. I mean, I know the name and I know some of his stuff, but I don't know if he's related to Bernays.
Or Bernays must have been aware of him because he.
Oh yeah, I think he was for sure.
Because I think he. One was sort of foundational for the Pavlov's work and conditioning and things like that, and so I thought maybe he was a confederate of Bernays.
A confederate, yes. Well, I happen to know a guy who was in high-level PR work, and he never ceases to be amazed at how controlled people can be. Right? It's like he gives examples how controlled the system is today in the United States. Like after Katrina, there was like a 24-hour period where they talked about refugees, and then it became a banned word in the media. Right? There are no refugees because this is America. Right? Refugees happen in, Libya, right? And he talked about how with the Fukushima, melt-throughs, the different core melt-throughs that are just endlessly spewing forth, he says that in the U.S. now, they essentially talk about leaks. There was a leak, right? And the implication is that the leak is over. But first of all, they weren't leaks. They're melt-throughs, right? Which is incredibly far more serious. But it's the system of controlling people. It's the soft totalitarianism that the United States has come under, right? And that's the problem with this. If you're dumbed down, you don't even realize that it's not far into this soft kind of totalitarianism. Getting back to John Gatto's book for a minute, one thing in there that I thought was of note is he and his family had a National Merit Scholar, which is like a scholarship level kind of thing in the United States. And this gal wrote a letter where her dream was to be a small part in a great machine. And John Gatto said he was heartbroken when he read that, because he doesn't think that's what you would have seen 50 or 100 years ago. The idea that I want to be a cog in a machine, right? The spin is positive, right? But when you think about that, what made America great, it wasn't that, well, I want to be the machine cog that, puts the grease and the, you know what I mean? It was like, what do you mean? I want to invent something, or I want to be the first person to get a car that goes this fast, or you know what I mean, right? I want to be the first person that gets to the South Pole or something, right? Yeah. Right? It's not like, oh, I want to be better at, whatever it is, working some, piece of machinery that does something. That's really quite disappointing. And I too would be a bit heartbroken if I had somebody, whose scholarship level material saying that her dream was to be a cog.
Sounds like a future president.
Yeah, that person could do well in today's America. And so I think, talking about this in classical education finally, how do we get better, right? How do we wise up? Which I'm going to argue wise up is one way of saying the opposite of dumbed down, is we need to undo what was done. And then we need to think about, how do we become wise? How do we have wisdom as a common thing? And it's a little hard because wisdom implies more than just the ability to answer questions, right? On a test or something like that. But I'll give you a quote from Count Leo Tolstoy in his essay, his long essay, Education and Children. And you can think about it. This is from the 1860s. He says, take at hazard 100 children of several educated generations and 100 uneducated children of the people, and compare them in anything you please, in strength, in agility, in mind, in the ability to acquire knowledge, even in morality. And in all respects, you are startled by the vast superiority on the side of the children of the uneducated.
I would say that's quite accurate.
Now, isn't that interesting? Tolstoy was quite an observer. Um, Now, you can argue that, well, that was that period of time in Russia, and that's not today, right? That's not the modern world. Yes, you can make these arguments. But I think we should take it to heart that we like to think we're living in this evolutionary period where everything is better now than in the past. But this whole show is basically arguing that when it comes to literacy or thought, America was tremendously better 100 or 200 years ago than today, even with all of its problems of racism and other things. I mean, black literacy in the United States was far better 150 years ago than today. That's amazing to think about. I mean, how can that be, right?
I saw a figure, which of course I can't remember the numbers completely, but of the number of newspapers per capita in the United States in 1776 compared to now, and it's at least 2 orders of magnitude higher in 1776. I mean, that's how much stuff was being printed and distributed and moved around compared to now.
That was before schools.
How did anybody know how to read? I don't understand.
They may have printed the truth a little more freely back then than they do now as well.
Well, we know that.
Who was buying all those broadsides and all that stuff?
Well, the people. Because the people could
but
read.
what were they doing with them? They couldn't read, right? No, they couldn't. But I was just
can't read.
Yeah, exactly. I was just flabbergasted. Right. I was flabbergasted. I mean, I was thinking, what is this? And I happened to be in an area in New England, a really tiny state, Rhode Island, So, and in that little tiny state, in 1900, there were something like 3,000 newspapers. That's got to be almost the same number. It's probably 10 times the number of...
That's more papers than are in the U.S. today.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So I think that, I mean, if I don't know what kind of benchmark or metric that might be, but I think it's...
if you ever get the chance to look at newspapers from 150 years ago or something, 130 years ago...
I do. I have. I mean,
You just get down on the ground and weep. I mean, there's nothing else to do, right? To think that the masses could comprehend the kind of stuff that was discussed, it's painful. And that's what we've lost. But this show, we want to have a little bit of an upbeat here. We've had all this discussion of what's wrong. But there's a lot of good news here. The good news is, like John Gatto argues in his book, it is very, very simple to have a society of thinking people, a society of people who can do good things and successful things. Because it's actually the norm. It's part of the human condition, the human capabilities. It's always that an elite, for different reasons, but basically evil reasons, wants to dumb people down. And he gives examples in his book, but one of the most obvious ones is he talks about driving, right? And he says, we all assume that anybody with just a few hours of practice can go out and drive, right? You can go drive 60 miles an hour with a thing that weighs thousands of pounds, and you could easily kill a bunch of people. It wouldn't be hard at all, besides killing yourself. And the licensing requirements are minimal. We just assume that everybody can do it, right? It's the de facto default assumption is that anybody can drive. You can't function in the U.S. without driving, except in maybe, New York City or something. And when you think about that, that's quite an assumption, but it's true. And he goes into different examples like anybody can buy gasoline, right? You could start fires, you could blow things up, you could do all kinds of things with gasoline. But anybody can basically go buy gasoline. Causes very few problems. The few problems that we do have are basically when factories explode or something, right? Workers get injured. In other words, what he argues is that our assumptions about human nature are wrong. The correct assumption is that people have tremendous innate talents and abilities. And like Tolstoy is arguing, it's really just part of the human condition. They're there. In other words, that achieving wisdom that Aristotle or Plato or something had, All it took is being around people who cared, and then, in other words, it didn't require thousands of hours of drills and memorizing everything imaginable. That's not what it required at all. It's a natural, innate human ability. We have amazing powers. And just as people can learn to drive, well, people can learn to read very difficult novels. People can learn to recognize all those logical fallacies that appear on TV or in politicians' speeches every day, right? It's not hard. Anybody can do it, almost. I mean, maybe 98% or something. Now, with today's vaccines and some other things, I mean, sure, there's a higher percentage of people who are basically really poisoned beyond hope today. So maybe instead of 99% can do it, maybe only 96%. But nonetheless, it's not a hard thing to do. And that's one of the good things about Gatto's book, is that essentially it's not pessimistic. We can show in history and in modern American times all kinds of great results that were achieved in a very simple way. All we've got to do is just do the same thing. It's not hard.
Part of the problem, though, Plain, is the signal-to-noise ratio. The noise in modern society is just intense. And I think people have to figure out a way to cut down that noise first. And I guess the first step maybe might be to turn the TV off and don't turn it back on.
Well, what you're saying is, if you were a benevolent dictator, you would outlaw TV or something, right?
More or less.
I would too. You'd have to have a license. I would, some people talk about like gun control and stuff. I want TV control.
Speaking of which, sort of on topic, but a bit of a segue. The Learning Channel. Do you guys remember when the Learning Channel used to actually have interesting documentaries on it? What's on the Learning Channel now? It's like utter crap about getting married and wedding dresses and just complete garbage. It's almost like a representation or like a microcosm of what's happened to the educational system.
Well, I think because we've had a power concentration at the top, and these guys are all with the agenda, and they want to dumb everybody down, right? I mean, I mentioned a minute ago this PR guy I know. He has talked about how the response to things today, like the BP Gulf oil volcano or the Fukushima melt-throughs, has been so tremendously better than in the past, like let's say with Chernobyl. But a key reason is that there are only a few companies that own everything now, right? And for all we know, they're actually, let's say there are 6 corporations that control the American media. It's entirely possible that those 6 are basically all owned by the same group of people. I mean, we can't be sure about that, but I'm just saying.
Not just possible, but likely, in my opinion.
But I think it's likely because you see so many hints of it, right? Companies that are supposedly competitors and they do things in the same day, right? Or they roll out things that required a fair bit of preparation, and they do it at the same time. And you just have to say, well, they're not competitors then. That at minimum they're working together on something, or the NSA or somebody told them to do something and they do it at the same time, something like that. And I think a case could be made they're actually all owned by the same group of people. But so that makes it a little simpler. And yeah, so the TV, of course, it's become essentially part of the problem because it got bought up. That TV show, when it started, whenever 20 years ago or something, might have been independent. And then at some point it got bought up by the same people who bought up everything else. And it's really painfully obvious. I mean, a lot of websites, I mean, like yahoo.coms or something, I look at it, it's like, this thing is nothing but junk. I mean, it's nothing but Hollywood stuff. I mean, it's really useless. But yeah, anyway, that's certainly a case. But getting to the kind of idea of how do we improve things, the answer that John Gatto is talking about is that we need to return to the idea of older style education, which is not schooling. We need to get away from schooling. We need to get to learning, and learning you acquire in life. And Benjamin Franklin's technique worked great. You just take a side and debate it with somebody. And then you take another topic, right? Now, you don't do this socially at a party and anger people. That's not the point. The point is that you're trying to learn. You're learning how to learn, right? And if you have that list of logical fallacies, if you have some of these things, you can learn quite well. And even the people that you think are not so bright, they can learn. It might take them twice as long, but what's the difference? I mean, when you're 50 years old, who cares whether it took you, 3 years to learn a subject or a year and a half? What's the difference, right? You go through life as a very productive member of society. And so I think there's a lot to be upbeat about because we have the resources to turn it around. We have the experience, at least in the United States, to say that, 200 years ago, according to studies that were done at the time, like Pierre Dupont's study, his study was 4 in 1,000 Americans couldn't read well. Now, so you mentioned about how there were all these thousands of newspapers, like in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Well, okay, 4 in 1,000 people didn't read. There you go.
That might explain it.
Isn't it pretty simple? I mean, now, they weren't poisoned by food additives. They weren't poisoned by nuclear tests and, you know what I mean, chemtrails and stuff like that, right? So, again, it's going to be a lot harder today. But the point is, it's the normal default human condition that we need to shoot for, which is essentially being wise shouldn't be a rare thing. It should be a common thing. And I think this is not nearly as hard as some people might think. All we got to do, first of all, we got to wipe out some of the do-gooder utopianism.
Yeah.
Well, it's failed so painfully.
Or at least make it irrelevant. I mean, it really is, especially when it has the, when in the shadow behind it, it has so much power because of just the technological stuff. Yeah, but I totally agree. So.
They're a lot worse because somebody who's doing evil and they know they're doing evil, it's pretty easy to call them out on it. But when someone sincerely thinks they are doing good, I mean, man, it's hard to deprogram that out of them.
It sure is.
Well, there's that famous quote by Goethe that is it Goethe? It's one of the German. I think it was Goethe, but it might be another one. That no man is so hopelessly enslaved as he who falsely believes he's free. And I think that's true, and I think modern America has this other problem, and that's how we got into the mess we're in, is if you think you're free but you're actually a slave, well, then how do you fix things? You don't recognize that there's a problem. And I think you see that in education. I have seen people, actually, I'm not trying to pick on something because I don't even follow it, but I happened to see a headline while I was going somewhere that I guess, I'm assuming it's some like friend of Trayvon Martin, the case of the black young man who was killed in the case in Florida that became a bit of a public story. And the woman essentially was arguing that she's not stupid because she has a 3.0 grade point average. But just listening to her for 5 seconds or whatever, you'd say, well, well, a 3.0 grade point average does not mean what it meant when I was a kid. Let me just put it that way. Right? 3.0 grade.
But the technocrats are really happy. She said 3.0. That was the benchmark.
She thinks that she's like solidly educated.
Yeah, well.
Right? And I'm just saying that the blacks in America just recovering from slavery 140 years ago were far better off than she is. And she doesn't know it. That's the problem. And it's the same thing for, the whole society, is that if you don't know you're ignorant, how can you fix it? Right?
Plain,
yeah, go ahead.
How do you see the homeschool movement fitting into this, which is, I mean, it's always been around, but it seems to be burgeoning. Do you think there's any possibility that it will have a positive contribution to American education?
Oh, I think it already has. It's had a huge impact. So yes, I mean, let's say spelling bee champions and things like that. I mean, already probably 3/4 of them are homeschooled kids. Um, it's impacting the world greatly because I've made this case in other shows that um, the thing that you need most to make the world a better place is good models. Because if you can get in your mind, and everyone can get in their minds, the idea that this is something that works and we should shoot for, then you basically can try to copy it, modify it, make it work for you, right? And so homeschooling has a lot of varieties, right? I mean, there's no question about that. But if you look at the way they generally do it, you're going to say, geez, this is immensely better than what the normal public schools are today. And by the way, the public schools, this is another issue, but the public schools are going to go corporate. The charter schools, all these things are going to really make and this is interesting, by the way, and ironic, it's going to head towards the Soviet system, but without the same technical skills. Charlotte Iserbyt talks about that lately the last few years. We're better off having the old public schools of 30, 40 years ago than the free market, supposedly charter schools, because there'll be free market, but there'll be no way for parents to have any input. There'll be no, elections. There'll be nothing that you as a parent can do, and that's a terrible thing. But anyway, the homeschooling thing is a great thing. I mean, that's how I see it. What do you see?
I see it the same way. I think I have in the past lent some support to local homeschoolers in the Mordor area because I think I see the kids and they're just amazing. I mean, they're able to think up creative solutions much faster, I think, than their peers. I think they have not lost their thirst for knowledge, and their curiosity hasn't been suppressed. And I think it's on the other hand, that I think the downside, at least for now, is that it does take time, and the economics here make it so that people feel like they have to have, families feel like they have to have two jobs. So who's going to homeschool? I mean, sort of practical considerations like that. But I agree with you. I mean, I think it's and in some ways I don't have any ill feelings if parents choose to homeschool their children in a very even dogmatic, somewhat religious way, where people bring that up as being a problem. I mean, I think any kind of individual learning like that occurs in the smaller setting of homeschool education, helps the child almost in spite of themselves or the actual teacher.
Just on the note of the religious aspect, famous Canadian author by the name of Robertson Davies, he actually mentioned that at least when the Bible and the religious education was in the schooling system, it was basically the modern equivalent of a classical education. And taking that away has also removed that from the education system.
Yeah, I think you're right. I guess one of the things we haven't discussed too is the what kind of education, or what kind of education does one impart, and how does that help keep a culture together? And I think certain school movements have philosophies on that. In that, I think it's, if you're going to live in a particular country that has, say, strong Western traditions, then the point is not to learn the history of your oppressors, as sometimes it's called, but the point is to, I think, get a universal language in which to think and discuss, and be able to go to an art museum and actually know that John Milton wrote about this painting, et cetera. So so some would say the Western canon for here, and the in Japan it might be something totally obviously relating to their culture. And I think one of the things I've seen is the lack of focus on at least one particular culture to sort of get an idea of how to look at a culture before going ahead and looking at other cultures. I guess they call it the multicultural kind of education. And I'm not sure that's a good idea, but I, not being an educator, probably shouldn't comment any further.
Well, this is a. I mean, first of all, I don't agree that there are ways of teaching that don't involve values of some sort, because the topics you choose to discuss essentially lead to various, I don't know if you want to say conclusions, but they drive the results a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea, I mean, if you just say, and if you take a neutral point of view, if you say that, well, some say that the Aztecs, throwing people into the fire pits was a good thing, and then some people say it was a bad thing, right? I mean, it seems awfully contrived to me, right? I mean, I think we should just discuss history, discuss things, but you have to have a cultural literacy to function, and the broader it is, the better. But we're discussing the West here. I think you have to know Western history, and as a matter of fact, it'd be a tragedy to lose it because, look, the United States can't all of a sudden turn into Asia or something. You know what I mean? You can't gain. All you can do is lose, right? So you should keep what you have and then try to study the other systems, in my opinion. And, I don't think we have to push Christianity on anybody. I mean, but that's, to me, kind of a moot point. I mean, we've been basically kind of anti-Christian in the schools for at least 20 or 30 years. Excuse me. So I don't even really see it as much of an issue, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the ridiculous things they're pushing in schools today, I mean, they're talking to children about condoms and homosexual sex and all kinds of strange stuff. And it's like, look, until the kids learn to read and write, what is this all about?
Oh, I guess I a little misunderstanding, but I mean, I agree with you. I think, yeah, some kind of value system needs to be transmitted. Yeah, because
as far as the the homeschooling, though, I think, look, this works well. The question is, are there types of schools that are somewhere, I don't know, are there groups or churches that are not like numerous, like let's say Quakers, for example, or something, where, or for that matter, Waldorf schools, where the results are good, and I don't know how to put it, but they're not strictly homeschooling, but they're not the governmental, bureaucratic, corporate state that we're creating. And we need to look at those. And I just think we need, the more competition, the better. We need more and more open systems, and I'm all for it. Are there drawbacks? Yes. But the point of today's discussion, though, is in a sense, you don't even need school. You need environments where people can learn. And I think we need to focus on that, too. In other words, let's take, for example, the kids have summers off. Where can they go where they have places to learn that are not schools? We need to think about that. Can there be, again, groups? It could be Waldorf, it could be Quakers, it could be anybody, to create places where kids who want to learn can. I mean, I always had the problem in schools that essentially I was lucky, and whatever I want to say, that tests were no problem, that kind of thing. Essentially, there were limitations. I mean, it's like I always want, okay, well, do you offer advanced courses? Well, that's not enough. Do you have more? How can I get more? How can I get more? Right? And we need that for everybody. Because no matter how bright you are or how good on tests you are, there's still the fact that you can't study everything, right? There's woodworking, there are all kinds of subjects that you could be studying in school. And anyway, I'm just upbeat that if we read books like John Gatto's book, we can get an idea that everybody can drive a car. It's not unreasonable to think that everybody can read a difficult novel. This is not something that's unimaginable. It's something that was routine 100 years ago. And all of these utopian, bureaucratic, totalitarian types have only made things infinitely worse. but they'll never admit they were wrong, right?
Yeah, well, that seems to be part of the course. Yeah.
But I'm upbeat that, to acquire wisdom, first you've got to admit, as I say, that you made a mistake. And so I talk about this like in terms of politics. To fix something, you got to admit you got a problem. And if somebody turns on TV and says, I'm proud to be an American, America's the freest country on earth, and we're out there promoting democracy around the world, well, you got a problem. Because, first of all, it's very debatable if the U.S. is the freest country on earth. I've been to all kinds of countries, and I don't know that I would make that argument. I mean, I'll give you like two things that are metrics that should be relevant. What percentage of people are in prison? The United States is far higher than the Soviets. Right? If you include all the people on probation and everything like that, the United States is like the greatest police state the world's ever seen. Now, it's a soft kind, right? Everybody can buy Twinkies and watch football. And then another one would be, what percentage of people work as policemen or security guards? And I'd say it's quite high in the United States. Now, that's it's a judgment as to what that means. But I'm just trying to say that you can't learn unless you want to learn. You can't fix ignorance if people don't know they're ignorant. And this is one of the challenges we face. But I think the actual solutions are like driving a car. The solutions are, in a sense, easy if people can admit that we need to do it. And that's a bit of the challenge. But,
yeah, well.
Yeah, but I'm upbeat because I think that if you compare now with, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago, far more people realize that something's wrong. And as I'm saying, you've got to realize there's a problem to want to fix it.
Well, yeah, right. I think the other hopeful thing is that children are naturally rebellious. Many children are naturally rebellious, and I think that is a very good thing. So that when they're rebelling within the educational system, as they have been doing, to the point where a quarter of them in urban centers are drugged with amphetamine congeners to keep their attention going, I think that might go on for a period of time, but I think at some point, perhaps, one thing that might happen is people do figure out that you can't give those things to developing brains, just like you don't give alcohol or other drugs to developing brains. And all of a sudden, all that stuff stops. And I think if that ever happened, there would be a sort of mini evolution within the schools on that Monday morning when the drugs were pulled off, because I think some of that is society in its less than good way pushing on the children because they are rebelling against what they see as what they see, maybe not consciously, but they feel is just wrong. What's being done to them is wrong, and this is how their behavior is the result of that. So, in other words, rather than changing the educational system, the do-gooders, I think, have made it such that a quarter of the children need medications to live within that system. And, I think that's one of the that's truly one of the tragedies of I'm sorry, I should have probably brought this up earlier because I really don't want to end on a down note. And I also don't believe that things will not get better in the system. It's just that some things like that could have been prevented, say, in other areas. For example, the people in the drug industry who allowed these drugs to be given to children without adequate studies of long-term toxicity have really created this nightmare, I think, because...
Well, wait a minute, Herm. You're assuming that they didn't do studies. Maybe they did, and they've hushed them up, and they want those negative results.
You might be right. You might be right. Maybe they figured out that these drugs prevent frontal lobe growth or something. Who? I mean, it's a little extreme there, but yeah, I mean, it might be. But I think going forward, I think all that you've mentioned is positive. But there are these there are these situations, these ongoing situations, such as that, which is the drugging of the peds, of the peds that you will teach, which is a problem. So,
Well, yeah. Well, clearly we have lots of problems here. But
yeah,
what I'm trying to say, though, is that fundamentally humans have superpowers. If, whatever, 99.3% of people were very literate 200 years ago, that number might be exaggerated, but there's no reason to think we can't essentially achieve a similar thing if we try. The first thing is we've got to get people to want to do things right. In other words, we need kind of a spiritual awakening of sorts. And I'm not saying it in some sense that we all need to go to to a church every day or anything like that. I'm saying we need to want to wake up. We need to want to achieve things. And in an environment where the guy down the block, one direction, is an Edison, down the other direction is a Tesla, down the other direction is a famous, medical researcher, that kind of thing. Almost anything is possible. I mean, you can achieve what you set out to achieve. And this show is about the dumbing down, but it's not just about schooling, it's dumbing down expectations, right? When I was younger, the expectations were tremendously higher. I mean, you could be an astronaut, right? You could be whatever. Set your mind to it, and you can do anything. Now, I know that wasn't true. I mean, if you were born in the ghetto or whatever, it was going to be tough.
right. And women also had a much harder time.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely.
But I grant you that the feeling was, that you could do it if you wanted to.
You could do anything, including with women. I have relatives who, were some of the earliest, first woman, on the nuclear bomb program, various things in my family. And I'm just saying that I know they had a tough time. Being a top physicist, 70 years ago or something was not easy for a woman, that kind of thing. But I'm just pointing out that, hey, they did it.
They did do it, right.
And they did it because they thought they could, right? If they'd sat there and said, I can't do this, I can't do that, well, then you'd never get anywhere. And so I'm just saying we need that can-do spirit, and I think we're working on it. We can do it. There are solutions. And what we're not going to find, though, is we're not going to get it by getting trapped within their system to, let's say, change the curriculum slightly. We need more radical changes like homeschooling or going to a Waldorf school or something. And I'm no expert in Waldorf schools. I'm just trying to say we need to essentially have revolutions, not working within the system is not going to work, in my opinion, with small changes. I think you've got to aim higher, so to speak.
Right. And watch out for those do-gooders.
They're all over, I tell you. Geez, and America exports these damn things. You travel around. Here you are minding your own business somewhere, Cambodia or something, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh my God, there's an NGO, and next to them are a couple of Mormon missionaries, and it's like, geez, man, can't."
And then somebody selling coke, and it goes on.
Oh, right. Well, that's the other kind of. We export lots of things. We export pilots with dubious credentials and all kinds of strange things. But you know what I'm trying to say.
I hear you.
Anyway, I think we can wrap it up with this for today. Obviously, we could go on a lot longer, but this is just an intro. Any closing thoughts, Oolong?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick quote here because anybody who knows me knows I'm quite fond of Taoism. And in chapter 20, the first line of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, "Abandon education and there will be no more sorrow." So I think that sort of fits in with your quote from Tolstoy. And my thoughts are basically that the education system we have now just sort of builds up our ego, which leads to a type of craftiness. And I think that's basically what he's saying in the Tao Te Ching, that if you don't have that egotistical, crafty type education. You're just going to abide and do the right thing.
Mm.
all I
That
got.
sounds like a wise quote, by the way. There's something that, something you can't digest quickly. You have to chew on that one a long time.
Yeah, you could certainly take it the wrong way, but I think if you, I think there's a positive way to look at it.
Mm. Yeah, that's worthwhile. Herm, any final thoughts?
I think it does. I think the future looks good. I think I think these kinds of discussions that we're having are small contributions to the sort of larger change that's happening, and I look forward to it. And I thank you also for your time.
Well, let's wrap up another edition.
We'll wrap up. Okay. Sorry.
Well, thanks, everyone. Appreciate you coming. Take care and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.